the STEO conference and organizers, I would like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Jovita Guiccerere. Dr. Guiccerere is an associate professor of science and environmental education in the Faculty of Education at Laurentian University. She teaches K-8 science and technology pedagogy courses for pre-service teachers. If you have any questions during the presentation, please share them in the Q&A. Do note that there is a button of sharing to everyone versus the host and panelists, so keep that in mind when you're sending the messages. And I, as the moderator, will try to ensure that all of the questions get answered. I will now pass it over to our speaker to continue on.
Thank you very much, Cassie, for that wonderful introduction. And welcome everyone to our session, to our party. And as Cassie mentioned, please feel free to put your comments, contributions in the chat. And just letting you know that the party will be as fun as we make it. It's the people will make the party fun. So what we are, since we don't have a poll, I will ask you to write in the chat, how you identify racially, and as well as by gender, like how you identify yourself. You can just put in the chat so that we just see the diversity of people in the room. Then we'll also want to know, for example, what is the diversity of students in your current classrooms? So I think, Cassie, you can go ahead and if something is added, we can.
Sure. So one participant is male and Black, another is female and white, another participant is a Middle Eastern woman, and the diversity of her classroom is fairly diverse. Another participant, her background is East and West Indian, cisgender. She uses the pronoun she, her, but since she has a non-binary child, she doesn't mind they. So those are some of the answers. Oh, and more answers coming in. A white woman, my students are fairly diverse, 75% not white. Female white, I am a teacher with a very diverse classroom. Female white, diversity, predominantly white, but becoming more diverse.
Mm-hmm. So
quite a mix, but sorry.
Okay. Yeah, it's quite a mix, although I don't think we have a lot of males in the room. So, but at the same time, like we said, I mean, like identity, we are not, like the poll, we were supposed to have, gender pronouns, as we know that, I mean, like somebody highlighted in their introduction that gender is not black and white. So we understand that as teachers, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir. So, I think it's just important for us to know that we have a diverse group of people. It's unfortunate we are not able to see who is here, and I mean, like to see each other because this is a different kind of Zoom. So I'm just going to start by using this quote from Verna Myers, who talks about diversity. She's a former lawyer. And she decided to, I mean, like now she's no longer, she has retired from law, and she is specializing in the issues of diversity, but mostly in the workplace. So since diversity is something that we are exploring in education and trying to find out and figure out how to really embed the issues, especially issues of race and so forth, that have not been part of the school curriculum and part of the school language, how do we navigate it? So I try to look for inspiration from people who are even in different fields and see how it can apply to education. So Fena talks about how expresses diversity as being invited to, everyone being invited to a party, but belonging being something that when everyone feels they're safe to dance and they feel like they're part of the party. So I just wanted us to think of a time, for example, when you were invited to a party where you felt awkward or out of place. Maybe it may have been a long time ago when you were in high school or school level and you don't remember it, but if you want to share, for example, if you have had such an experience, maybe you can share in the chat. Like I said, it's unfortunate that participants cannot speak verbally, right, Cassie? Like,
I don't know if someone wants to try unmuting themselves.
okay, they can raise their hand.
If you raise your hand, I can allow you to talk. Sorry,
okay.
Just realizing that. So if anyone wants to share their answer verbally rather than typing it out, let me know. But it looks like we do have one answer in the chat already. Layla said, not a party per se, but the whole of high school. It was like a puzzle and I was from a different puzzle.
Oh, that's a great metaphor, right? Just like, you're just part of that. So I mean, like your experiences throughout. So that's interesting. And is there anybody else who want to share?
Layla just added, it brings tears to my eyes even right now.
Oh no, Layla, I'm sending some hugs your way. I understand and I feel you. And such stories, I think we can all have different stories. And like Layla is talking about his story, and that story can be the story of our students, can be the story of, those students, like we talked about how diverse our schools are. But does everyone feel welcome in that place? So we know that we have policies, right? Every child has to go to school and you can get in trouble for not sending your child to school. And children have to bring their authentic selves to school. Like every morning they have to wake up and come to school and just be, just like every other child. And, the hope is that as they pass through school, they will succeed like everybody else. But when we look at STEM, we are still talking about how do we diversify STEM? How do we get more minority or other diverse people to get into STEM, especially people from minority cultural backgrounds and so forth. So for teachers, these are experiences that you have working with students every day. I'm sure these are visions. You can have visions of those students in your classroom, especially if you're in a diverse school. And sometimes you wonder, like, how do I reach out to that student? How do I really help these students? As a teacher, you want to be able to help them, but sometimes it's like the tools that you need for those things that are beyond the curriculum. Like, yeah, you can give them everything. You can give the extra help, you can give the extra support, but you still feel these students feel like they're not part of the party. You can see that, and it's you wonder, how can we go beyond policy mandates of just having everyone in the school, in schools? And yet, especially if you're in a big city, like I am in Sudbury, Ontario. And if I think about my story, I wasn't born in Canada. I was born in Zimbabwe, in Africa, and I went to school there. And the schools I went to school during the colonial era, when the British were the rulers in Zimbabwe. But at the same time, with schools that were predominantly Black, those are the schools I went to. And so the issues of race are things that we didn't talk about. We just understood we were Black people because there were white people as well in the country. And it was just like, oh, okay, you know your place as a Black person and white people have their place. But at the same time, in high school, grade 11 and 12, I ended up in a school that was formerly an all-white school. So after independence, they tried to open up those schools because most of the white families were sending their kids to South Africa for high school. So I was able to go to that school that was formerly a white school, and it was just a big difference from the schools that I attended. But at the same time, there were lots of different things that were so different for us, the few Black students who were went to these schools, the culture was different. The teachers, for the first time, were white teachers. And it was a different kind of atmosphere. And it was a struggle because I was specializing in chemistry and biology in high school, because the British system is different. In high school, you specialize in the areas that you want to study in university. But at the same time, I didn't really do well because the communication was difficult. And I mean, it was just a different learning environment from what we're used to. So although we were going to this school, I did not manage to accomplish as much as I'd done before. And I had to take an extra year to redo my high school, and then went on to university. But that's another story. So when we look at the diversity we have in this country, for me, it was difficult to get to learn about diversity because it was a new concept whereby it was reverse. I grew up going to school with the majority Black people. Now I was like, okay, I'm the teacher teaching white kids. And in Sudbury, most of my students are white students. So I have like the one Black student maybe once every 2 years, or, this year, maybe I have a few visible minority students in my class. And how do I speak boldly about race? How do I talk about race? It's something that I'm learning, just like all of you. It's not something that comes easily to me, but I'm learning and taking inspiration from people who have talked about the fact that, first of all, we need to confront our own unconscious biases, even biases about ourselves, especially for people who are from minority cultures, biases about ourselves in terms of our capabilities and are we good enough? Are we beautiful enough? Are we, do we measure up to the standards of culture? So those confronting that and being able to speak boldly are things that I'm learning from, taking inspiration from other people who have talked about race. So when we think about what our students face, for example, students from minority cultures. So in my, right now, I'm just talking about sharing like how we as teachers can make sure that students are comfortable. And then in the second half, I'm going to talk about how, what are some of the examples of things that we can do in science, in our science classes, to help students to achieve their best, students who are from different diverse cultures. So for now, I just want us to share, for example, like we're talking about, okay, all these kids, we don't know them, we don't really understand, but at the same time, there are things that happen in the classrooms whereby you can have students coming to report to you, or you hear a student saying some things that reflect racial ignorance. Are there some things that you've heard? So if you want, you can share in the chat some things you've heard or your colleagues have said they heard students say in the class, or students have reported to them. I mean, like, if you're comfortable sharing any examples.
So Layla said that she's heard homophobic things said by students in the classroom. So less racial ignorance, but other discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? And again, if you want to rename yourself to make yourself more anonymous, if you feel more comfortable sharing that way, you can do so. Layla's adding on, I think that people think racially ignorant things, but do not say them.
Mm-hmm.
Shannon's adding, students saying that's savage when something is cool.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what are some of the things that you for example, you have how you have responded to some of these similar comments. For example, if somebody says something that's homophobic or says, oh, that's, that's savage, or I mean, like, because they think it's, it's something that's acceptable to say, or if they say, oh, that's gay, or whatever like terminology they use. Or what are some of the ways that you think you could respond to that?
Oh, we have some more answers in the chat. I think responding to the prior question, if that's all right, if I go back.
Okay, yes.
Layla's adding, students still get segregated by race. Black students get sent to the office more than Asians. Linda's adding, students from Black and South Asian cultures in conflict using racial slurs to describe each other. And Layla also adds that sometimes people say that something is ghetto as another slang.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so if you're in a place, where you have that diversity, having students saying things about, like using racial, different racial terminologies to describe each other, I think those are things that can really, as a teacher, you cringe, and at the same time, you don't know what to say. But what are some examples that we can share of things that you, like, maybe Layla, you have tried to address some of these things, or anybody who wants to, you can share in the chat, like how you have responded to some of these comments, kind of ignorant in terms of the way the students use terminology to describe other students, or ways that they think they are cool.
So one participant responded, and I'm very sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Tezfazgi responded and said, one way to respond to this, you need to stop it and address it. Just kind of put your foot down.
Mm-hmm. So
Shannon, sorry, they come in quickly.
Layla,
Shannon's adding, you definitely need to intervene. And Linda says, we talk about respect and how to act and speak respectfully. There's different ways to handle the situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think Layla's hand is up.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I did not spot that. Allowed to talk. There we go. Layla, I think you're on mute, but you should be able to talk now.
It's actually Lila.
I'm sorry, Lila.
No, that's fine. Recently, there's been a couple of teachers who have made objectionable comments about certain types of schools in Scarborough. And one person, I just didn't even know what to say. Like they were saying that they were teaching at another school and I don't know, ghetto this or ghetto that, or the way the kids were behaving. And now at our school, kids behave really well and talking about that. But the way that they talked about the other school is really objectionable. And I didn't know what to say. I didn't say anything. But even in the past couple of weeks, there's probably been at least 3 staff members that have said something similar. And one of them I was able to interrupt because I work in school. My school's in Scarborough, and they were saying, "Oh, Drake came to our school, and why'd they come to our school? They should have come to the typical Scarborough school," and so on. And I just challenged that, because what is the typical Scarborough school? And the words that they were using to describe these so-called ghetto schools was just so bad. So I was able to interrupt that one, but it's the fact that people felt safe to say these horrible things was just really dismaying, and I didn't always know what to say.
Thank you so much for sharing, Layla. I think that's really something that can be challenging, especially with colleagues. And I know that sometimes if you're not close to people, it can be so difficult for them to say, you know, what you're saying is racist. But I'm lucky that I have colleagues that I can call out. So the other day, my colleague was like, because mostly it's the hair for me. You go with a new hairstyle and people are like, oh, I like your hair, or I like this hairstyle better. So I had short hair, my natural short kinky hair. And then I had braids on, or I think it was a weave or something. And she was like, oh, I like this better. So I said, so you don't like my other hair? Just because it doesn't look like the hair you used to? So we just laugh about it. And I said, do you know that's racist? So they've gotten used to me calling out and say, do you know that's racist? But it's something that will have said. But at the same time, it's not easy, like you're saying, Leila, if it's in the staff room, like how do you do that? But at the same time, what we are talking about today is speaking boldly. Like Leila, there's no way out. Like we have to speak boldly and just say it. Like you're not going to lose your job. And after some time, right now it's going to be difficult for your colleagues to hear, but at the same time, after some time, and when people, the more we talking about race, the more the people will realize, and it's going to take time. Even when you talk about Indigenous, it's looking at how many years it took to get Indigenous content in the curriculum. And so the issues of race, it has to start from somewhere. So one other person I got inspiration from is Ali Michael, a white woman who is now studying the issues of race and whiteness. So she grew up, she's a white woman. So race questions are not meant to lead us into a quagmire of guilt, discomfort, or isolation. So sustained race inquiry is meant to lead to anti-racist classrooms and positive racial identities and the restoration of wholeness of spirit and community. So she talks about growing up in Midwestern Michigan. So she says, I, Ali Michael, never talked about race with my family. We were white, all our neighbors were white, and it never occurred to us that there was anything to say about that. As a result, in later years, I developed a deep sense of shame whenever I talked about race, particularly in college, where I was expected to make mature personal and academic contributions to race dialogue. So what she's saying is something that I think most people can associate with or agree with. Like I said, I grew up, like in a Black community, and there was no need to talk about race until I moved to the States. So when I moved to the States to do my PhD, African-American colleagues or students were talking about race a lot. And I thought they were just making a big deal out of it because I didn't understand what racism was. And so, but other discussions we had, for example, genuine discussions that we had with faculty members, they were talking about how growing up, the only way they could learn about other people, like even from other countries, was through the National Geographic. It was always in the, middle-class families had to have the National Geographic. That's how you learn about the world. But how was the world depicted? So those are, those are things that, people started talking about, especially when I was doing my PhD, there was a lot of talk. So people like Ali Michael talk about how a multicultural curriculum alone is not sufficient for building an anti-racist classroom. So like Leila was saying, the fact that if teachers are speaking like that, even if the ministry comes up with a curriculum, how are teachers going to be using that curriculum if they have not, confronted their own biases? So the first thing is to be able to address your own biases, to confront your own biases. So the fact that racial socialization is a multidimensional process where students get messages from all these places. And some researchers talk about how like kids as young as 6 years old are able to, be able to distinguish by, racial, by race, and they attribute traits, positive traits to their own race and stuff like that. So it is important to start, if you are, teaching at younger ages, to start talking about race in more ways than just sweeping it under the carpet or just saying, oh, we have to be nice, but confronting it. So talking about race is not racist. So we have to understand that. For example, if a student, somebody says, if you're in a diverse school and students are calling each other names, and you just have to confront it and say, we have to have a talk, we have to have a discussion about this. But the discussions have to be ongoing. So there are some resources, for example, Edutopia has some resources that can help to, like, how do I talk about race? How can I set boundaries, especially when we are having discussions, so that we can set a safe space where students can be able to participate. So for it is race, for example, you can just start by helping your students understand that race is an essential a part of one's identity. So if somebody's Black, somebody's Middle Eastern, and somebody, that's their identity. It doesn't mean they're different in any way, especially in the science class. I think this is something that is easier maybe for us when we put it in the context of science and how we understand how human beings, the characteristics we have, and the genetics and so forth. So the other thing that other people talk about is to create a positive white identity. So when we're talking about race, we don't want people to feel like you are condemning people for, the fact that, okay, if you don't know about race, or if you have biases and you're white, you are not, if you're talking about, like, if you're a white person, you also have a positive identity, and you can be a white person who understands race, and that way it means you are able to, understand the privileges that come with being white, and you understand how, like the issues of social justice and so forth, and how to help people who are less advantaged than you are. So we want students, like, when they get to workplaces, how are they going to successfully explore the world? So talking to students about racism and privilege creates a culture that respects all people. So I know the question that we all have is, okay, how do I do that? How do I do that? I know I don't have an answer. I haven't tried it in my own classes. I have to try it with my student teachers. But at the same time, now when our students come to their professional year, they have done a lot of indigenous courses in university because it's required. And now they're at least more able to talk about issues of race and racism in a different way than you would with students who have never talked about it, who have never learned maybe explicit issues related to colonization and privilege and racism. So I think I'll go on to talk about who is it the part who is dancing. So if we look at the diversity of schools, so this one is just showing the visible minorities in Ontario. So we see that Ontario is very diverse. And this is just almost 50% of the school, like of the population, of the whole, Ontario population, about 50% is white. So this is reflected also in our schools, like schools in big cities, unlike schools in smaller areas like where I live. So there is diversity of minds, like each student brings strengths and experiences. And you find that we have, especially in Toronto, I didn't ask where people are this morning, but if you are in Toronto, like Leila was sharing, it's more diverse, and you find that there are also students who are immigrant students who are coming from, even refugees and so forth. And these students, it doesn't mean that they were not in school. They were going to school and so forth. And so how do we, make sure that the strengths they bring and the diversity of minds will benefit everyone in the classroom, even if they are learning the language, even if they are second language learners. So we want them to feel to feel that this school is not different than the school you attended in Afghanistan. It is a school. Yes, you're learning a different language, but we want to embrace you. We want to, so those deep, like discussions about race and class and identity can help if students are knowledgeable about issues of race and they're accepting. The new students will feel comfortable when they join the class and they won't feel awkward. And the other inspiration I get when we comes to curriculum is thinking about how the curriculum reflects the children. Like how do students engage with the curriculum? So Lisa Delpit, who has done a lot of work and written about how teaching other people's children, talks about if the curriculum we use to teach our children does not connect in positive ways to the culture young people bring to school, it is doomed to fail. So we know that our school curriculum, especially in science is this subject that is like supposed to be objective, right? And it's just like, okay, I'm a science teacher, I teach science, but you teach kids, and then you teach those kids that you don't even, you're struggling to really, get them to, to feel like they're part of the school. You want them to feel comfortable. You want them to, to excel. So the curriculum, we know that it's just a roadmap, although we are all like, okay, yeah, we have to address all the expectations. But then there are also different routes to that destination because we are teaching kids. And we have to make sure that our curriculum is responsive to the students that we are teaching. So if you're in a very diverse school, you may find that you may just choose like, okay, this is what I'm going to be able to cover, but I want to make sure that whatever content we cover, the students understand it. And we'll take time to make sure that the students are reflected in the curriculum. So what is the effective route to get there? So I think one thing also that we need to understand as science teachers is the fact that there are biases in this discipline inherent in the way science knowledge is created. So this book, Bridging Cultures, Indigenous and Scientific Ways of Knowing Nature, it's written by Glenn Aikenhead and Herman Mitchell. It's a very good book because they take a good look at how science started, like as a field. It started as philosophers asking questions, existential questions. And then, all these groups of people started, small groups of people started getting together and talking about, trying to come up with answers. Where did we come from? Where did the world come from? And this is how the field of science was born. And so they talk about how, for example, when we look at Indigenous knowledge and the ways of knowing that Indigenous people have, and they try to explain how the world works and how the world came to be. So they look at the parallels and look at the fact that there are different ways of knowing. So science is not this, just one way of explaining how things work. So science knowledge creation is, it's based on the context. So a scientist will come up with explanations depending on the knowledge that they have, they've learned in school, or the knowledge that, they have acquired, but also their cultural context comes into play as you look at your data and think about what are the ways to interpret that data. So, as teachers, we need to be able to understand the nature of science, but also to be able to teach the nature of science so that students understand that science is just one way of understanding. And the fact that, for example, when it comes to Indigenous knowledge, we need to understand it as another way of learning, of knowing. And different cultures have different ways of knowing. So that will bring respect in terms of respecting people from different cultures, bringing different ways of knowing. So as teachers, we are not going to be asking students to say, oh yeah, so can you share the ways of knowing in your culture? Because the students may not even have an idea. But at the same time, if students appreciate the fact that it's not, science is not just, coming from the Western science is not just the only way of knowing. Okay. Do we have any questions? You can ask as we go. So now I just want to move on to give some of the examples in science. I am taking inspiration from the Freedom Writers. I'm sure some of you have watched this film. It's a very old film, and which is now being used a lot by people who are trying to find ways to, to see how we can reach out to students, especially in diverse schools. So the people have come up with different, like in teachers' colleges, they are using resources that are based on, that are being developed by the Erin Gruel, who wrote who was the teacher who on which this movie is based on. So she was teaching these kids in a very diverse neighborhood. And this is the class, like, for example, when Lila was sharing how the teacher was saying, oh, a typical, school in the, a typical, or if you want to call it a urban school, a typical school where you think, where there's a lot of diversity. And there was this class that nobody wanted to teach, and it was given to this new teacher. And she did everything she could. She tried different ways to engage those students. And in the end, she made a big difference. Now she runs an institute of these freedom writers. So what she used was writing to get to know her students. She used, she was an English writing teacher. And so through the students' diaries, she was able to understand, to know her students. And so some of the resources that have been developed for teachers include, Ms. Gruel's secret sauce, whereby we are identifying the different ways she has tried to reach out to her students and bring them together. So building bridges among students from different cultures. So these are students from minority cultures, but they're different cultures. And in this case, they actually belonged to different gangs. And she managed to bring them together. She believed in her students, celebrated their success, and validated prior knowledge. So I'm just going to pick a few of these and look at how can we put these in practice in science. So I know that I had this question. What are some of the strategies you have used to get to know your students? So if you want, you can just share in the chat. What are the different ways you have used to get to know your students, especially if you're in a very diverse school with all these students from cultures that are different than yours? So Cassie, you can feel free to chime in if anything shows up.
I think it's just taking people a moment to type their answers.
Okay.
Lila mentioned, ask them about the music they like to listen to.
Okay, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. So that can be a great starting conversation, right? So if they write about the music. So in science, how does that connect?
Shannon added, ask about favorite foods and recipes.
Mm-hmm. So this can be, you're getting to know your students. It doesn't have to be all about content, right? So these are great, like, starting conversations, and you want them to feel connected to you as a teacher and connected to the class. So the first recipe that I'm looking at is creating community. So what Ms. Gruel did is she gave the students some journals and asked them to start writing. They didn't want to write, but she said, no, I don't have to read your journal. If you want me to read, you can leave it on the shelf. But if you don't want me to read, just take it with you. So slowly students started leaving their journals. And so through their writing, they shared a common identity, which united them into a community that connected them, not separated them. So although they belong to different gangs, she was able to, when she read those journals, she could see that they were all hurting. They were writing about the problems they were having and, in their families and so forth. And they have lost somebody to gang violence and so forth. So she used different activities for them to be able to see that they had more in common. So
we have a few more answers in the chat, if I can add before you move on.
Yes,
I'm sorry.
go
It's hard
ahead.
for me to interrupt. Brianna mentioned that she's tried surveys to get to know her students, but that she didn't get the feedback that she was hoping for. And then Lila's also added that she's asked students to share a cultural recipe and a recipe from another culture, and then connected it to part of the plant. And it was a very cool exercise. So.
Oh, that's perfect. I think those are all great ideas. Yes. I mean, like, you have to start from somewhere. And it is a great way for the student that may make a big difference for them to realize that the teacher actually, acknowledges what I think and what I feel and what I like. So keeping a personal science notebook or journal that you can ask students to write, because like somebody said that they used a survey, but they didn't get the answers they were hoping for, because I think it's limited and like the students, maybe they write what they think you want to hear, maybe. But if you ask them to have a journal where you say, you know what, write what you want, and, connecting what we have learned, for example, it's a science journal, but I want you to be able to write even your feelings, or you write, anything that connects or anything that disturbs you from, doing your work or anything. But you can give them the opportunity to share it with you or not, like for you to read or not. And you can also ask students to use their second language learners, allow them to even write in their own language in those journals, and also in English, so that they can develop their understanding. The fact that we just want to look at, you give them that freedom. Although they won't be submitting their work in their language, they will submit it in English, but this will give them a doorway to continue to understand using the language that they're used to. And another source is validating prior knowledge. So like Leila mentioned about music and so forth. And so we know that all these students coming to our classes, even if they are, refugee students, they've been to school. So cross-cultural teaching acknowledges worldviews, that is different ways of knowing. And we are trying not to be colorblind. So asking students how they understand, or when we talk about music, asking them to use the music that they like, or make music to show your understanding of science. So what Ms. Gruo said was that it was amazing how savvy they are. They are walking encyclopedias when it comes to pop culture, quoting the lines from the movies verbatim and reciting every CD. I think the key is to build on what they already know. So instead of, even if you want them to write lyrics to show their understanding, you just have to make sure that they are actually showing, like, how does this relate to the content I'm learning about the human body and so forth. And so we move on to the next.
Could I quickly interrupt before the next slide? There's just a few more examples in the chat.
Yes.
So Linda was mentioning using Flipgrid videos has been a good way to get students to introduce themselves. And Shannon shared that despite being a chemistry teacher, talking about astronomy events like eclipse, meteor shower, northern lights, and hiking trails or nature that is accessible to my students, opening the door to them to engage with science outside of the scope of my course.
Yes, I think taking students outside the scope of your class is another great way to get to know students, because in the classroom, they come, they sit at the desk, and, it's the grill, and how do you know them? You are focusing on the curriculum. So if you include those experiences, taking them out of their zone, or even using those videos, I think those are all great ways to get to know your students. So motivating your students. So when one of the Miss Cruel students asked it, why do we have to read books by dead white guys in tights? She realized that she needed to look for some other readings that are, that will relate to the students. So, definitely in science, we use textbooks that are generally just like textbooks. So, but at the same time, it is important to make available some books, or even, recommending books to the library that students can check out, for example, for their book reports, science book reports that are written by different people from different cultures. There's so many, there are different books by indigenous authors, Asian authors, Black authors. They could be limited, but then, for example, Hidden Figures was not written by a Black person, but it's about Black women scientists. And I just wanted to share some projects that I've used, integrating indigenous content with my pre-service teachers, where we have looked at issues like, for example, case studies of integrating environmental science, environment, and indigenous integration. And I find that these help students, like their expectations in the curriculum from grade 1 to 8 about, impact on the environment, impact of science of the environment. But we also want to look at impacts of science and technology on indigenous communities, which we know is happening. And it is actually students come up with realizing that the systemic racism is causing all these impacts on indigenous communities. For example, the poisoning, mercury poisoning in the that is happening in grassy narrows, and it has been going on for a long time, and the water advisories that are happening in the indigenous communities and so forth. And so this can be linked to science, to actually science, learning about science topics, but we are intentionally building in the issues of racial justice, environmental justice, and how science plays a role in these issues. The science component is a little bit challenging for them, but at the same time, I challenge them to be able to look at the science. And that's when they realize, okay, the issue of bioaccumulation and biomagnification happens in the food chain, and it's causing the mercury poisoning. Other resources that I use, for example, there are these cross-cultural units that have been developed by teachers in Saskatchewan, working with Glenn Aikenhead, who was at the University of Saskatchewan. So I think this will be in the resources, and you can look at them. And they actually help to see how you can integrate, for example, indigenous content in the science curriculum, although you cannot just take these units and use them as they are, because they are culturally relevant to the people. For example, they do trapping and they do wild rice growing, which doesn't, wild rice is not grown across the country. And so this is a resource that I thought I could just share with you if you want to look at how you can integrate indigenous knowledge in science. So there are different topics that they have looked at and integrated indigenous content. And oh, that was the last one. Okay. So, okay. So yeah, I know that I just had to rush through the resources so that we have a little bit of time to, if anyone has questions or if anyone has anything to share.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Goikerere. We appreciate you very much for sharing your knowledge on making diverse students feel like they belong in their classrooms and that they feel supported and can succeed in STEM. We'd also like to thank our platform sponsors, Explore Learning, for supporting the Zoom platform for this session. So we do have time now for some questions. So if you want to type them in the chat or raise your hand and I can unmute you, we can try and get through as many possible before 12:30. So a few people saying in the chat, thank you very much for the session. So that's great.
Thank you.
And I think Yvette was mentioning, yes, please. I think that was in relation to some of the resources you were offering to share. So Lila is asking if you will be able to share the slide deck. She wants to get the link from the last slide.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll be sharing the slide deck, but you can also email me.
I'll write that email in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, I think the slides will be. Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't submit it. Okay. Yeah, so you can email me.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, I would be happy to share that with you.
Perfect. And there will be also the sessions recorded, but whichever is easiest for people to get in touch or get the information.
Mm-hmm.
Another person saying thank you. Where can we access the recorded sessions? That's a good question, Kathy. Let me, I think it's somewhere through the Zoom platform or the conference event website, but I can check and get back to you quickly on that. And I think the recordings will be available for up to 3 months after the conference, if I am remembering correctly. Yes, Brianna is confirming 3 months is what she read as well. Linda said, I think the recordings are available in the conference Zoom lobby right now. Awesome, that's what I thought. Okay, so that's probably the case. So wherever you went to access this talk, the recordings should be there as well. And if you can't find them, I'm sure if you email anyone who's involved with the conference, they'll be able to point you in the right direction for it. Any other? Oh, here we go. So Kathy said she would love to see a list of the resources. Thank you for sharing. I will be teaching environmental science next semester and would love to have an Indigenous focus.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, that's something that's great. So like the projects that I shared, that I said I do with my students, what grade level that do you teach?
Kathy, do you mind adding what grade you teach into the chat? Or I can also unmute you if you'd like to just chat about it. Grade 11, Kathy said.
Oh, grade 11. Yeah. So these projects, I think, I mean, like for me, I do them with students for grade up to grade 8, but grade 11, I think it will be perfect for senior level, as students will be able to do more research. So I think, okay, so we're talking about the projects, right? I was just talking about the projects that I do with the students. Yeah, so what I do is I ask them to choose a case. I give them examples, and sometimes they find their own case. So I say, find an example where, there has been an Indigenous people, it involves Indigenous people, and there is an impact, an environmental impact, which is caused by where science and technology comes into play. If you email me, I can send you just some information about the kind of project that I give my students. So I give them examples of cases, high profile cases that have happened, but I also look at, Indigenous communities around the world. Some students have done research on Indigenous communities, like in the Amazon, deforestation in the Amazon and how it is impacting the Indigenous people, forest fires in Australia, coltan mining in the Congo, and so forth. So the students do research on this, and so they can actually see these issues, how the environmental issues and how science and technology impacts. But also when it comes to environmental science, yeah, I can share some ideas if you want, because I also teach environmental education, and but I focus mostly on action oriented, and where students actually do stuff, because research shows that knowledge alone does not is not helping to change like people to become more pro-environmental. So thinking about, okay, if they understand the environmental science content, how do they put it into use to become more, to lead more sustainable lives and even help others become more sustainable? So I can share some resources with you on environmental science.
That's great. Would you mind going back to the slide with the list of resources and URLs? Someone was trying to take a screenshot of that. And there's a lot of good discussion in the chat about resources for incorporating Indigenous knowledge into STEM teaching. People are mentioning there's a lot of work on Indigenous medicine and chemistry, and just trying to find how to focus on Indigenous peoples of Canada. Someone else, Linda's mentioning that there's a documentary called There's Something in the Water. It's a good starting point for grade 11 environmental science for discussing environmental racism impacting Black and Indigenous communities in Canada.
Okay, so she has access to the chat, right? So she can be able to get.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And I think there was the other, I guess it's 2 slides with resources.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
So this one, so this one has so most of these are websites that I have used for this presentation. And the other one, is on issues of race. This one is on mostly in Indigenous content.
Perfect. So I do think it's 12:30. So I think I unfortunately have to, all this is great. And I think there's a lot of good discussion happening. I do have to wrap up the session. So thank you again very much, Dr. Jovita Guequerere, and to all of our attendees. One thing I'd like to note is please don't forget when you're exiting this session, a survey will pop up. And if you have time to complete that, I know the conference organizers would greatly appreciate it. So I think there's one session after this. So I hope you enjoy that if you're going to it. And thank you all so much for attending and being so engaged in today's discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for sharing. And thank you. And thanks, Cassie.
Thank you very much.
Great moderation. Okay.
Thank you. It was a great talk. I learned a lot, and looks like everyone enjoyed it based on everyone saying thank you so much in the chat.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. Okay.
All right. Bye.
Okay, bye. Okay.